So once upon a time, many, many, many years ago, I actually went to school, high school. And I remember high school was not really designed for boys, at least not the kind of boy I was. You know, the kind of boys that are active and liking to do stuff. Maybe I should change that and say elementary school was not really designed for boys. All of you that are parents of boys, you can probably see where I'm going with this. Boys, we like to be active, we like to do stuff, we like to be, running around and stuff like that, and school is just not like that, especially not in elementary years. But I remember when we got into high school, we actually had some electives, and we could take woodworking or shop class. We could do mechanics. I remember doing a class on auto mechanics, and things like that were much more hands-on. And something amazing happened to the boys. These boys that were struggling, just barely passing, just really having a difficult time, looking forward to the minute that school was done and couldn't wait until grade 12 was over, all of a sudden came alive. In shop class, it was like they became a whole new person. Or in mechanics class, it was like all of a sudden this person was the top of the class who otherwise could barely get themselves together to even hand in assignments, let alone try to pass classes. And you ask yourself, what's going on here? How come somebody who hates school can all of a sudden be totally engaged? And I think the answer is that we all have different kinds of areas or different kinds of intelligence that come alive in different settings. Not everybody is cut from the academic cloth. For example, a lot of boys and sometimes girls aren't either. But sometimes there's physical activity or kinetic intelligence, they call it, if you're going to be really fancy. And when you can do something with your hands, all of a sudden you thrive. My cousin was like that. He barely was passing in school all the way through, and then he got to high school and he aced his auto mechanics and his wood shop classes, top of the class. And he went on to become an auto mechanic and has done really, really well in his field. And so the truth is, we're not all the same. We are actually made differently. And we do best when we can be doing the things that we are best shaped for or cut out for. I think that's pretty obvious. That's a no-brainer, if you will. Today, I want to unpack the spiritual equivalent, if you will, to that. Because there is a spiritual equivalent to that. Some people believe that spiritually we're all cut from the same cloth, but that's not what the Bible teaches. And I want to actually look at that a little bit this morning. So I want to look at a passage in the book of Romans. Now, Romans was written by a guy named Paul. Paul was very academic, extremely highly educated, very, very well respected in the leadership circles of Israel. And then he met Jesus in quite a dramatic way, and I won't go into that right now, but it totally transformed his life. So much so that he basically threw everything out that he once really valued, and he completely changed his path in life. So he was really familiar with this whole transformation thing that we talk about in Jesus circles quite a bit. And Paul, actually, his name was Saul before that encounter, and he felt that the transformation was so profound that he was a different person. So he took a new name, changed his name from Saul to Paul, and so here he's writing about some of the realities of following Jesus from the transformed mind perspective. So I want to look at Romans chapter 12, starting in verse 4. And this is what he says. So just as our bodies have many parts, and each part has a special function, so it is with Christ's body. We are many parts of one body, and we all belong to each other. In His grace, God has given us different gifts for doing certain things well. So if God has given you the ability to prophesy, speak out with as much faith as God has given you. If your gift is serving others, serve them well. If you are a teacher, teach well. If your gift is to encourage others, be encouraging. If it is giving, give generously. If God has given you leadership ability, take the responsibility seriously. And if you have a gift for showing kindness to others, do it gladly. Don't just pretend to love others. Really love them. Hate what is wrong. Hold tightly to what is good. Love each other with genuine affection, and take delight in honoring each other. Now, Paul was writing to a mixed group here. Some of them were Jewish believers who had converted from Judaism to following Jesus. And they had one mindset, but there was also Gentiles or Romans that had become Christians, and they had another mindset. But they had grown up in a similar culture in the sense that the Greek culture had influenced that whole area of the world. So the Romans had embraced the Greek culture, the Jews had learned to speak Greek and had been influenced by that culture as well. And so they had some things in common. One of the things that they had in common was that they were both very familiar with a very hierarchical religious system. So in the Roman hierarchy, the emperor was at the top of the pecking order, if you will. The Romans actually were instructed to worship the emperor as if he were God. They actually were supposed to believe in the deity of the Roman emperor. And then under him there were, other gods and priests and so on and so forth down the pecking order to the common person. In the Jewish religious system, you had the high priest at the top of the pecking order, and then under him there were other priests, and then under them were the common people. So nobody except the high priest had direct access to God, and that he only had direct access to God once a year. He would go into the holiest of holy in the center of the Jewish temple, and he would offer sacrifices to God, and then otherwise he would stay out in the second area, which was called the holy place, and the priests would also go in there, and every day they would offer sacrifices and burn incense and so on in that area, but common people weren't allowed in there. But then there was a hierarchy within the common people in the Jewish system as well. So the Jewish men had closer access to the temple than the Jewish women, and then Jewish children and so on, and then the Gentiles, they stayed in the very outer courts of the temple. So there was this hierarchical system that they had, and basically both cultural systems were such that you had to have a good relationship with your priest. That was the key to having access to God. And basically, if you were well connected with your priest, and you did that by giving them gifts and being kind to them and so on and so forth, then you had better access to God than not. So you basically were just trying to be good to the person above you in the pecking order. And you trusted that you, through that person, would have access to God. So connecting to God ultimately boiled down to how well connected you were with your priest. And this was how their systems worked. Unfortunately, there are still churches like that today. 2,000 years later, there are still churches in this world, even churches that claim to follow Jesus, where there are hierarchies like that, and where ultimately you need to be in a good relationship with the priest or the man of God or the upper people on the pecking order in order to be in good standing with God. But that's not how Jesus intended it to be. So here Paul is showing them, and ultimately us, a completely different way of looking at our relationship with God. He uses the human body as a way to explain how God is connected with us and how we're connected with one another. And basically what he's saying is that we're all different. We have different functions within this organization or within this body. But every single one of us, even though we're different, is important to the functioning of the whole. And he's not saying, this organ is less important because it doesn't have direct access to the brain or to the head. He's actually saying everybody is connected with the brain. Everybody is on a first-term basis with the head of the body, Jesus, and we all interact with one another in specific ways in which we are designed to interact with one another individually. So nobody can say to the other person, well, you should be like me, which is what hierarchies do in a sense. Hierarchies say, well, if you want to get to God, you need to be on good terms with me, and in order to be on good terms with me, you need to somewhat be like me so that we can relate to each other. And so everybody's trying to sort of emulate the person above them in the pecking order, and you end up with this warped system where everybody kind of looks the same. And the key thing is that love permeates everything in this body of Christ. There's systems that run throughout the whole our whole physical bodies. And we have some doctors in our church, and if I brought one of them up here, they could probably explain in great detail some of the different systems that run throughout the whole body. And it's the same thing in the body of Christ. There's one system that runs throughout the whole body, and that's love. Love is a common denominator for every single one of us. We love God and we love each other, and that's how we serve one another. Now, we don't serve each other in the same ways, but it's still driven by love. Love is the thing that makes all of this function. And basically what he's saying here is, we all love each other, we just love each other in different ways. And that's okay. There's no hierarchy. There's no one way of loving is better than another way of loving. We all love in different ways, but it's equally valuable. There's a book written a few years ago called The 5 Love Languages. Basically, the author, is it Curtis Chapman? No, Stephen Chapman. Gary Chapman, that's the guy, yeah. Gary Chapman. He did some research and found that there was 32 different ways in which people relate to each other in loving relationships. And in order to simplify that, he grouped them into similar ways of relating to one another in love and boiled it down to 5 basic ways in which people love each other. And he called those the 5 love languages because they basically are ways in which people love that are so different that if you don't understand that way of loving, you may not even feel the love coming from that person. How many of you have read about the 5 love languages? A few of you. Okay, let's just see if we can remember them. So, one of them is encouraging words. So some people, their love language is hearing or saying encouraging things. So we just had a demonstration of that love language here a few minutes ago. Encouraging words. And another one is works of service. So that's when you actually do stuff for another person. So, maybe some of you have met, often it's a man, but sometimes it's a woman, and they would never tell you they love you, but they're always looking for something they can do for you. And if you don't get that, you don't realize they're actually saying I love you by using their hands for you. Another love language would be physical touch and closeness. So how many of you have met a person that's always hugging you? Okay, so that's physical closeness and touch. So they're always wanting to be close to you physically, and that is a beautiful way of expressing love. But if you're not one of those huggy types, you might not get that. You might not feel the love. So what's the 4th one? Gift giving, right. So some people, they just love Christmas because gift giving is their love language. And they're always thinking about how they can bless somebody with a gift of some kind. And then the 5th one is quality time, right. Quality time is when you give somebody your undivided attention. And so when you are going to express to somebody, I love you, the way you do it is by shutting down everything else in your life, including your phone, believe it or not, and giving them your undivided attention. And this is a way of saying, I love you. So, when we each do love or express love for each other in the way that we are uniquely designed to do, it's a beautiful thing. But we need to respect the fact that not everybody does it the same and learn to appreciate the way in which they do that so that we can receive the love, so we can understand it, so we can feel it ultimately. Now, in John chapter 17, and I encourage you to go home and read this for yourself, Jesus prays for his followers. And the interesting thing is, he prays for unity in his followers, that they would be one. Now, the fascinating thing about this is if you read that passage, that prayer that Jesus prayed for unity through Old Covenant or Old Testament eyes, where everything is very hierarchical, you will read the word unity as uniformity. Because that's what hierarchies want. They want everybody to be the same. And so when people who attend churches that are very hierarchical, very structured that way, with very clear who's in charge and who's under them and under them and under them, typically they will look for unity by having everybody act the same way, dress the same way in some cases, talk the same way, act the same way, and so on and so forth. And you've probably known people from churches like that. Maybe you've even been part of a church like that, where there was a specific dress code. You were supposed to wear these things. You were not supposed to wear those things, especially when you came to church. There was a specific kind of actions, maybe even a list of actions. These were things that were definitely not allowed. These were things that were definitely supposed to be done, and so on and so forth and so forth. And so we often, in those kinds of environments, have a very high fear quotient. Uniformity in hierarchy is almost invariably driven by fear. The fear of the consequences of not being in uniformity with everybody else. And so everybody walks around trying to make sure that they are crossing all their T's and dotting all their I's according to all the rules that they think that they need to be following. And unfortunately, because this has been common in churches, a lot of people outside of the church have said, forget it. I don't want to have anything to do with that kind of stuff. It's hard enough to live my life without a whole bunch of extra rules that I have to follow. I just don't want anything at all to do with that kind of stuff. And I go, ooh, but I'm so sorry, you've misunderstood completely. That's not at all what Jesus wanted. But people don't want to be living in fear. That's natural. And if you have come out of that, and if you have been questioning whether church is even for you or not, I certainly don't blame you for questioning. If I had lived under that, and I have lived under some of that, it caused me to question too. Because that's not a good way to live life. Not at all. And I think one of the big things that we as followers of Jesus need to be talking about is, that's not the way church is intended to be. That's the good news. That's the gospel. The gospel is that we don't have to live in fear. We don't have to live in uniformity. We can live in unity. Well, what's unity? Well, Jesus' definition of unity is love, respect. Is where we value one another in our diversity of expressions of love. This is what true unity looks like. And Jesus encourages diversity, and he encourages humility to learn from one another in that diversity. So one person expresses love this way, another person expresses love that way, and when we humble ourselves, we can actually learn from each other's way of expressing love. And it's a beautiful thing. And that's what genuine unity looks like from Jesus' standpoint. See, Jesus actually levels the playing field. He knocks over all of the hierarchies. And when you look at it from a big picture standpoint, that's exactly actually why Jesus came. The Jews and the whole world, for that matter, had gotten so hung up on the pecking order and the hierarchies that Jesus just came and says, enough of this. We're going to wipe all of that out. We're just going to all be equal before God. And so his followers wrote the words, now in Christ, there's no longer slaves or free. There's no longer male or female. There's no longer Jew or Gentile. Everybody is one with God or before God. And another one of Jesus' followers, he wrote, we are now all priests. It's not that there's this hierarchy of priests and the high priests up here and then the other priests and then we are the paupers down here. He says, no. Every one of us are now priests. We are all in that equal standing before God. It's amazing how Jesus totally turned everything upside down in the thinking of the religious world of his day. It's an amazing thing. And Jesus, see, the whole religious thing in that day was people and God are far apart, and we have the responsibility to work our way towards God. And Jesus said, no, forget that. God is coming down to you, and he's going to be with you. And one of the beautiful names of Jesus that we celebrate at Christmas time is Emmanuel. Emmanuel literally means God with us. He's here. We don't have to somehow work our way up some kind of proverbial hierarchy to get to God. No. He wiped all of that away and came down to us. And he said, I'll never leave you. I'll never forsake you. I'm right here with you. I'm staying. I'm moving in, and you can't get rid of me. I'm right here with you. That's what he said. So, that's 2,000 years ago. Let's move forward 2,000 years. Different time, different place. Now we're in North America, not in the Middle East, and we're in the year 2019. Western culture, not Middle Eastern culture. What has this got to do with us today? Well, Jesus' way of thinking has so profoundly influenced the world in the last 2,000 years that it has literally transformed the way we do things, especially in the parts of the world where we have followed Jesus' teaching. It has had more influence in some parts and less in other parts. Let me just name a few things where Jesus' way of thinking has profoundly influenced culture. 2,000 years later, slavery is no longer legal. Why is that? Because of Jesus' way of thinking. If you do some research this afternoon, get your Google out and do some research on the end of slave trade, it goes directly back to people who championed the ways of thinking that Jesus taught when he was here on earth. William Wilberforce, for example, the MP from the UK that really was the champion for this, was a devout Christian man. And he did it because he felt called of God to champion this. Now, am I saying that all slavery is demolished? No, there still is human trafficking and sex slaves and things like that, unfortunately. And we still, as Christians, need to be standing up and saying that is wrong. And I'm so proud of our Member of Parliament, Arnold Viersen, who is a Christian himself, who stands up in Ottawa and around our country and says, human trafficking is wrong and we need to end this here in Canada and around the world. It's Jesus' way of thinking. Another thing that has changed, I believe, directly as a result of Jesus' way of thinking is women's status in our culture. Think about it. In most parts of the world where Jesus is not worshipped, women's status is far worse than where Jesus has had direct influence on the culture in a profound way. Women are often seen as just, a chattel of some kind, or they're owned by men, or some form of almost slavery of some kind. But in the Western world in particular, where Christianity has had some influence, Jesus' way of thinking has lifted women to a much, much more respected place in our culture. Now, it probably should be more. I don't think women are respected equally with men the way Jesus intended it to be, but it certainly has become much better than what it was. Children as well are treated much better by people who follow the thinking of Jesus. In many, many parts of the world, children have been badly treated, and they still are in some parts where child labor is still a fact, and where children are left to die, and so on and so forth. It's terrible to think about some of the things that are done to children, but this is not the way of Jesus. The way of Jesus is profoundly different from that. Let me talk about it in a broader sense. If you study political history, you will see the emergence of democracy as a political system in the areas where the influence of Jesus' way of thinking has been the most profound in cultures. Now, democracy isn't a perfect system, certainly, and there's probably all kinds of things that we could still do to improve that. But the fact is, in democracies, average people have a far greater influence for good than in many other cultures where there's a ruling elite that just focuses all the power around themselves and treats the people as if they are just, there to be slaves to them. And the truth is, that kind of influence that we, the average person, have in a democracy was unheard of before the time that Jesus came. Another thing that's fascinating about the Jesus way of thinking is that often now in Western culture in particular, but even in cultures just that are influenced by Jesus, people are encouraged to blossom as individuals. This was not necessarily part of culture always. It was something that has come, I believe, as an influence of Jesus, that he wants us to be all that he created us to be. And so this has taken hold. Up until Jesus' way of thinking really influenced culture, children sort of just grew up to do whatever their parents did. And it just followed that pattern. Whether you were good at it or not, or whether you liked it or not, it had nothing to do with it. And the interesting thing, however, is that in our culture, we are encouraged to thrive and do what we are good at, not because of love, but because of selfishness. Because we as people do better individually when we do what we are good at. And so for selfish reasons, we choose to pursue things that we are good at in our vocations and in our hobbies and so on and so forth. Jesus actually calls us to do it for love's sake, not for self-centeredness' sake. He encourages us to shine as brightly as we can with our love. And not for our own glory, but for the good of everyone. For the sake of love. And this leads us to my question today. How does my love shine the brightest? I invite all of us to ask that question of yourself today. See, I believe that whatever way in which my love shines the brightest, that's probably what God has created me to do. For example, maybe it's when I'm working with children that my love flows the freest. Or maybe it's when I'm working with seniors. Or maybe it's when I'm working with people with disabilities. Or maybe it's when I'm working with people that are struggling in their marriage, or with single parents. Or maybe it's when I'm working with people who are hurting emotionally, or with the sick physically, or with people who struggle in some other way. Or maybe my love shines brightest when I play music, or when I do art, or when I'm fixing something, or when I'm building something. My wife would disagree with that for me. That's an inside joke for those of you who have been around. Or maybe it's when I'm writing. My love flows when I'm writing the best. Or when I'm serving food. Or when I have people in my home. Or when I take people out for coffee. Or when I give money away. And on and on and on. There's so many different ways that I can express love. My question for all of us this morning is, which way shines the brightest in my life? And there's no guilt or shame in admitting that I'm not really good in this area. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not asking you to look at what you're not good at. I'm asking you to look at, where does this shine brightest? And maybe you need to ask somebody close to you and say, hey, where do I really find that I shine the brightest? Or where do you see that I'm shining the brightest? The answer to that question, I believe, could be the key, or at least a key, to you really thriving and to us really thriving. And I believe that's really what Jesus is after. For us to thrive because love flows. We truly become a whole person when we follow the plan for which we were created. And that's a beautiful thing. I'm reminded of a story of a fellow named Tony Campolo. Maybe you've heard of him. He's a preacher. He's from Chicago, I believe. And he was invited to go to Honolulu, Hawaii, to preach. And so he gets on a plane and goes over there. And for those of you that have flown, you know about something called jet lag. Well, from Chicago to Hawaii, there's quite a time difference. And so he gets there, and 3:30 in the morning, bing, his eyes are open, and he can't sleep anymore. And so Tony Campolo, he's one of those guys that's, just can't just lay there when he's awake. So he gets up and he goes out on the town trying to look for a place to have something to eat. And he finds a Greasy Spoon place, and he goes in there, and yeah, it's a Greasy Spoon place, all right, but he figures, well, it's better than nothing. So he sits at the bar there and asks for a cup of coffee and a donut, and the guy shoves it his way. And a few minutes later, a whole whack of prostitutes just come piling into that place. It's that time of the night. Well, he's taken a little bit aback by this. He's not used to being out at that time of the night. He's not used to that whole kind of world. But he's sitting there at the bar, drinking his coffee, eating that, and he's kind of just listening to them talking. And one of the ladies says to another one, hey, tomorrow's my birthday. And the other lady goes, well, so what? You want me to throw you a birthday party or something? And she says, no, I'm just saying, you don't have to be mean. I've never had a birthday party in my life, so why would I expect somebody to give me a birthday party tomorrow? So the girls finish their coffee and they go on out back on the street, and an idea comes to Tony. And Tony says to the cafe owner, hey, did you hear that lady that said that her birthday was tomorrow? And he goes, oh, yeah, that's Agnes. He says, does she come in here every night around this time? Oh, yeah, every night, exactly the same time. He says, how would you feel if we threw a birthday party for Agnes right here tomorrow night at 3:30 in the morning? The guy just kind of stops and he just looks at him and he says, that's a great idea. And he hollers to the back, hey honey, there's this guy here that wants to throw a birthday party for Agnes tomorrow. And his wife comes out and she goes, what an amazing idea. Agnes is one of those people that just never does anybody any harm. She's kind to everybody and nobody does anything nice for her. I think that's a great idea. So Tony says to the owner, he says, well, would you mind if I bring a cake tomorrow night? And, oh, no, don't bring a cake. That's my thing. I will make the cake. Okay. Well, can I bring some decorations and I decorate tomorrow night? Oh, yeah, you do that. Well, the next night he got there around 2:30 and he starts decorating. And the word had gotten out on the street, and the girls started piling in until he figured that every single prostitute in all of Honolulu was packed into this little Greasy Spoon diner. And by 3:30, he has the place completely decked out. And sure enough, just like clockwork, Agnes comes stumbling through the door at 3:30. And she walks in, and there's this great big sign that says, "Happy Birthday, Agnes." And the whole place just breaks out in happy birthday. And she literally is getting weak-kneed. She just stumbles back, and one of the girls behind her catches her. And she's just dumbfounded. And the owner of the cafe comes out with this big cake and all these candles burning. And he says, "Agnes, blow out the candles." And she's just standing there dumbfounded. She doesn't know what to do. And all of a sudden he says, "Come on, Agnes, blow out the candles or I'm going to have to blow them out." And Agnes, she doesn't know what to do. So finally he blows them out. And he says, "Come on, Agnes, cut the cake. Everybody wants some cake." And she's like, she's just standing there, and then he says, "Well, I mean, you don't have to cut the cake. I can do it for you." And all of a sudden, she just says something quietly, and she says, I've never had a birthday cake in my whole life. It's absolutely beautiful." And she says, would it be okay if I took it home and showed my mom? And the guy's just like, "Well, it's your birthday cake. You can do whatever you want with it." She says, I'll be right back. I just live down the block. Don't worry." And so she grabs this cake and she walks out the door like she's holding the Holy Grail. And she's walking down the street with this cake at 3:30 in the morning. And she's taking it home to show her mother, who has never made her a birthday cake in all her life. And Tony is all of a sudden standing there in this quiet diner packed full of prostitutes. So what does a preacher say at 3:30 in the morning in a diner full of prostitutes? Well, of course, he says, "Let's pray." And so he leads all of these people in a prayer for Agnes, prayer of blessing. And everybody's just in stunned silence. And then when he finishes, the cafe owner turns to me and says, "I didn't know you were some kind of preacher or something. What kind of church do you belong to anyway?" And he said in that moment he had one of those brilliant ideas that only comes maybe once every 10 years. And he said, "I belong to a church that throws parties for prostitutes at 3:30 in the morning." And the guy says, "Yeah, right. If there was a church like that, I'd join that church." See, the truth is, everybody has a different way of showing the love of Jesus. His way was very unique, but I guarantee you it left a deep impression on a whole bunch of people at 3:30 in the morning in Honolulu. I don't know what your type of love language is, but God knows because He created you. And I believe as we enter into 2020, God is calling every one of us to be all that He created us to be with regards to love. And so my question for all of us to think about as we wrap up our service today is, what way does your love light shine the brightest? Maybe that's something that you can wrestle with over this Christmas season. Maybe it's something that will come to you as you open your heart to God and just say, God, show me what this is. Whatever it is, I believe God will give you a clear sense of how to shine your light to its fullest potential in the coming days and months. Thank you, Crystal.
Thank you, Pastor Dal.